Gunaidin from here. I realize you're in different places, so for some people it's not Gunaidin, but that's okay. It was suggested to me that because all of you younger people anyway have essentially grown up within the Hizmet movement, that it might be of some interest to you as to how I became engaged and involved with it coming from the outside. And I would say that the first stage of that engagement and involvement was just people. There was a group that was created at Georgetown, where I teach, that involved some administrators and some faculty and a few grad students, that was discussing, of all topics, the concept of death, the soul, and the afterlife in the Abrahamic traditions. And one of the grad students said, "Oh, well, I know who can talk about it from the Jewish perspective," and that was me. And so I attended and then became involved with this group that was discussing that subject from these three perspectives. And that led to the guy who was running the Rumi Forum here in Washington at the time, whom some of you may know or know of, Ori Z Soltes, asking if I wanted to present a program at the Rumi Forum on two books that I'd recently written, one about 2 years before and one that had just come out, because they were both interfaith. One was on symbols in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim art, and one was on mysticism in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. So we did kind of a program, and I gradually became more involved and more interested. The people whom I met and the people with whom I engaged seemed very different from the story that I had of the movement from the one individual I knew at Georgetown, who was involved in the Turkish studies program, who is a very secular Turk, and who, as many secular Turks are, was clearly rather terrified by Hoca Efendi and the movement that is associated with and inspired by him. He jokingly would refer to him as the devil, but I think he really meant that. So, that was odd for me, but nothing and no one whom I encountered seemed to suggest the devil, quite the contrary. I do remember the first conference that I attended and that I spoke at. The phrase that was still very much in use was, well, there were two things. The phrase that was in use was still Gülen movement. And I remember suggesting that that wasn't a particularly good phrase to refer to it, because to American ears, it sounds like a cult. And there was a gradual transition, and I'm not taking credit for it. I think the transition was already there, from using the phrase Gülen movement to using the more appropriate phrase Hizmet movement, because of course, that is what the movement is all about. It's about service. And while it is inspired by the teachings and the preachings and the very figure of Fethullah Gülen, and as much as I would say every member of Hizmet adores Fethullah Gülen, whether it's through direct contact or indirect, it's not about him. And he's the person who is most emphatic about it's not about me. It's not about me at all. It's about us and what we do for the world. And from his perspective, although he does not refer to himself per se as a Sufi, because he's too modest to call himself anything that might seem too complimentary, he has not only, of course, written a great deal about Sufism and teaches about Sufism and brings it into his teachings, but most particularly within his thought, as expressed by things he says and has said and things he writes and has written, is this idea that Sufism shares with mysticism in general, which is a principle that there is an infinite number of paths to the one God, and that the path that works perfectly for me may not work perfectly for you. That doesn't make your path less than mine. And that sort of an idea, combined with his sense as someone who, whether he is or isn't a Sufi per se, certainly is very much aware of and adheres to its principles. If the ultimate goal of a Sufi and the ultimate goal of a mystic is to become one with God, to fill oneself with godness, as it were, in order to do that, one has to empty oneself of self, because otherwise there's not room to be filled with God. And if I do that, I find that if I have a particularized sense, that my particularized sense of religion, of path to God, is the only correct one, that's myself speaking, that's my ego speaking, that's not God speaking. So that one can be as intense a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew as one could imagine. And indeed, in order to be a mystic in any of these traditions, you really have to be that. But at the same time, and there's no contradiction between these two principles, at the same time, you can be universalistic in your appreciation of the endless array and range of ways of seeking access to God. Moreover, and this is a point that Hoja Effendi has made a number of times, if you really love God, which is of course what a Sufi emphatically does, what a mystic emphatically does, then you have to love everything that God has created, and all of humanity, as well as the entire planet, was created by God. So I can't not love my fellow humans who happen not to be what I am, just because they're not what I am, if I truly love God. Because if I fail to love them, then I'm failing to love God, and then I really can't claim to really be seeking God in the way that a Sufi does. So the notion of Hizmet as not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, of doing for others, and hence the proliferation, as I need not tell you, of schools, of social services, of programs that bring people together, all as a kind of outgrowth of the sorts of things that Fethullah Gülen has written about and taught about and preached about for many decades, is a kind of natural development of the ideas becoming actions. So as I became more involved, more engaged with Hizmet people, or as we're fond of calling them, Hizmetis, as you know, I rarely saw a contradiction of the kind of principles that seem to be expressed in the writings of Fethullah Gülen himself. In fact, I was pleased. There is one individual I have encountered within the movement out of the hundreds, literally, whom I've met, literally hundreds, who contradicted that, who I felt didn't give a damn about me. I was coming a long distance to give some talks, and he was clearly not interested in the comfort or discomfort that I was experiencing, having come all this way, and so on and so forth. I thought, thank God there's at least one normal, selfish, uncaring person here, because everyone I run into in the Hizmet movement doesn't seem to conform to that. Rather, they're selfless. They're worrying about me, not themselves. They're worrying about others, not themselves. And it's, as it were, the exception that proves the rule. The other idea that struck me in that very first conference was that the word that was being used in English, tolerance, again, I raised my hand. I said, that's not the right word. Tolerance is this: I'm up here, you're down there. I tolerate you. I allow you to do what you do, but I don't really take it as serious or at my level. And then someone said, a Turk in the audience said, well, they're translating the word hoşgörü, and hoşgörü is not tolerance. It's really seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And I said, yes, well, that's the idea. And so gradually, as I became more engaged with Hizmet, and it was suggested to me, perhaps, that I might be interested in writing something about Hoja Effendi from my own particular point of interest, and it was Ali Yurtsever who suggested this. He said, what about something about mysticism? So I took about a year. I said, let me think about it. And I read everything that I could get access to by Hoja Effendi. And by the end of that give or take year, I felt very comfortable placing him in particular relationship to, not only to Rumi, the 13th century Sufi, whose principles of combined intense Islam and universalism coexist so richly in his writing, in his thinking, that I ended up writing a book which placed Fethullah Gülen in the context of Rumi and others. And by others, I said I mean, of course, his thinking is not just influenced by Rumi. It's not just influenced by Sufism. It's not just influenced by Muslim thinkers. It's influenced by a range of thinkers, beginning with Socrates and Plato in the Greek tradition. And I pointed that out and pointed out how the principle that is most precisely conveyed from Socrates to Gülen is the principle of it's not just about talk, it's about action. And Greek has two particular terms, logos and ergon, that figure into Platonic writing that records Socrates' thoughts again and again and again. Socrates just doesn't just talk about things, he exemplifies them. But his range of operation is relatively confined because he's part of a culture which, like most cultures, thinks of itself as superior to other cultures. So Socrates is really thinking about the Greeks, and he's not thinking that much about the rest of the world. Whereas Fethullah Gülen comes around at a different time, in a different place where access to the world is much more richly possible. And he may have started out thinking about Turks. In fact, I believe he did. And he may have started out thinking about Muslims, and I believe he did. But by the time he has moved from the first, let's say, 2 decades of his preaching and started to move away from frequent preaching and toward much more frequent writing, his vision, his understanding of reality has broadened exponentially, and he's become more overtly preoccupied, not just with Turkey and not just with Islam, but with the world, with humanity, and with the recognition and the realization that it's only if we go at it together that we can get where we need to get to. If we try and isolate whoever we are, whatever that group is, and separate it from everybody else, it's always going to fall short. So all of this is by way of my expanding awareness of the Hizmet movement by way of the people that I had met, the people whom I had met, and then by the writings that I had read by Fethullah Gülen himself and the writing myself that I was doing. So not only this book, which by the way was called Embracing the World, my word embrace being the word for hoşgörü in a kind of rough translation, as opposed to toleration, but embrace, because that's what I perceived in the teachings of Gülen and the Hizmet movement, embracing the world and not really tolerating it. And of course, a number of different articles in different volumes that dealt with different aspects of the world and the relationship between either the thinking of Hoca Efendi or the action of the Hizmet world relative to these different issues in the world. I had not yet met him. On the one hand, I wasn't sure that it was a good thing not to have met him while I was trying to write this book about his thinking. On the other hand, I honestly didn't really have time. And on the third hand, I thought, well, maybe it's better not to. Maybe I can work more clearly without meeting him. But eventually, of course, I did. And now, of course, I've met him 3 or 4 times. But here's the thing. You may be familiar with this kind of, I'll call it a syndrome. So you've got someone you have admired from afar, some person who in some way is kind of a hero to you, a political figure, a movie star, a sports athlete, something of that sort. And then you meet that individual and you are so disappointed because up close in person, that person turns out to be a jerk, right? So here I meet Hoca Efendi, and I've had that kind of a distant, admiring relationship with him. And it was exactly the opposite. I could not have anticipated the impression he made on me in every positive, conceivable way. There was just a particular kind of charisma. A lot of people have different kinds of charisma, but the kind that he's got, this kind of humility charisma, which is genuine, because believe me, I've known plenty of people who profess humility and you can smell how fake the humility is. Just a little old me, but you know that it's like me is the emphasis. The genuine humility that exudes from that man and his embracingness, and I mean that literally, because we hugged when we parted ways. it was not a long conversation. By then, Emre Çelik had replaced or succeeded, is probably the better word, Ali as the head of Rumi Forum, and it was he who brought me to meet Hoca Efendi. And because my Turkish is very poor, and Hoca Efendi's English is probably almost as poor as my Turkish, Emre was the translator, the back and forth. It was a terrific conversation. And I remember, in fact, when I ran into my colleague at Georgetown a few weeks later, and he said, "What, you hugged the devil?" I said, "He's not at all." Now, here's the interesting thing. About 2 years after that moment, he and I, this colleague and I, were invited to Cleveland for a half-day kind of conference sponsored by like the Women's Club. I forget what the name, I forget the name of the organization. It was kind of in conjunction with Case Western Reserve, and it was kind of a day on Turkey. So my job was to talk about Turkey, kind of historical sweep, and his job was to talk about contemporary politics. Now, again, this is a few years back. So this is when Mr. Erdogan, I would say, had very clearly already demonstrated where he was taking Turkey, but hadn't arrived fully to the point where he's gotten since. So this is before the false coup, parenthesis, fake coup, false coup, not failed. I have been convinced from the first day that I read about it that it was actually Erdogan himself who made possible the events that came to be referred to as a failed coup. End of parenthesis. If anyone has questions, I'm more happy to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it if you wish. But what was interesting is that I expected that my colleague and I were going ultimately to butt heads because he's talking about the contemporary world. I knew he was not an admirer of Erdogan, but I knew what had been his feelings about Gülen based on our couple of conversations. And I was shocked because when we got to a kind of Q&A and dialogue after each of us had done our thing, he was much more in agreement with me. He had come around to see that what I had been saying to him for 2 years was true, which is encouraging for what it's worth. Anyway, be all that as it may, my subsequent experiences of meeting with Hoca Efendi only reinforced the first impression he made upon me, which, as I said, was rather a startlingly positive one. When again, another suggestion was made that I might write something about him. And it took me a long time. I then wrote this book that was not finished that long ago, which is, for the moment at least, it's called an Intellectual Biography. Perhaps there will end up being a different title. But for the purposes of this volume, I not only, of course, read more of his writing, and now I not only met him, I met him a few times and was able to ask him a few questions that I wouldn't have when I wrote the first book. But I also interviewed about 80 people in different parts of the United States, in Australia, where I had the privilege of being for about a week under the auspices of Hizmet there in Melbourne and Sydney and Canberra. And those whom I interviewed rather in the United States were not only Americans, a lot of them were, living in America. Some of them were from Germany, from France. So the interviews were in English, they were in German, they were in French, a lot of them were in Turkish. Again, Emre Bey was my translator in those cases. And what I tried to reflect on was a range of individuals, from those who were intimate with Hoca Efendi from his youth, of which there are, of course, a few who live there in eastern Pennsylvania with him, all the way out to people like myself, who are not Turkish, not Muslim, but are in one way or another involved in Hizmet. And I asked really 2 or 3 simple questions. That was it. The interview was very straightforward. How did you first encounter or hear about him? Or how did you first encounter or hear about Hizmet as a movement? What is it that impresses you? What is it, if you have criticisms of it, that you would try and change? and what is it that keeps you connected to it? It was very simple. And because after my first iteration of the manuscript that I sent off to Blue Dome, to Hakan Bey, and I had kept the interviews kind of rough-hewn as they were, and he suggested that I make them more readable, even though they would be less like an interview. You know, you talk differently from how you write, or you should, maybe. So this past summer, I was going through the whole manuscript again, and I have to say, rereading all that stuff after a distance of a year or so, I was kind of overwhelmed and impressed with the range and variety of different kinds of people who expressed the kinds of thoughts they did, which were all so consistent about him and about the movement. I to second Ibrahim, I look forward to seeing the volume when it comes out. And I think at this point I've babbled enough, and I'd rather open things up to questions if you have any. I should say one more thing, that I, along the way between the first and the second books, I think, I was able to attend a retreat that takes place in December out on the Eastern Shore in Maryland for a couple of days, a Hizmet retreat. And of course, I mean, I participated in every respect, except that when there were talks being given in Turkish, I couldn't understand everything, and Emre would help me a little bit with that. But I talked to people, obviously. I mean, I was serving food. I was participating in prayers and everything else, and in court classes and lectures as we had them. And one of the sessions that I was asked to do was with young people. So they were probably from 17 to 29 in age. And I asked them what they thought needed to be improved, or they asked me what I thought needed to be improved in the movement. And I did have a criticism. I said, from what I have seen, the men are in the living room, the women are in the kitchen. I rarely see women who are out front, involved and engaged that way, the way the men are. They're preparing the food, literally, or they're doing it figuratively. And what was interesting to me was, of course, in that group of maybe, what did I say, a dozen people or so, probably 7 of them or 8 of them were young women. And with one exception, they're all born in the United States. And they said, no, it's changing. And we're going to make sure it changes. Because from where we're coming from, that's cultural, and that's not our culture. So that is in the process of changing. So I would also be interested on I see a few heads nodding. I'd be interested in the feedback from you guys out there, as well as being very happy to answer any questions you have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ori, for this introduction, which has already stimulated some questions. But just to recap, so this bridging of the tradition and the universal is very apparent and central in Hoca Efendi's world. Similarly, these are very seemingly contradictory things that's difficult to reconcile, and the few have succeeded this in the entire history. So one is being anchored in your faith, and to use the word in a very orthodox fashion, and be open to the other, warmly be open to the other. That's another Hoca Efendi thing, and the Rumi thing, and the Sufi thing in the general, and your emphasis on this charisma, because charisma typically enslaves others, whereas in Hoca Efendi it's a charisma that is again contradiction in a contradictory manner, that's empowering the others, not towering over them.
Absolutely.
So these are just important points that I was trying to catch and highlight. So
Ibrahim Bey, one of the people whom I interviewed actually twice, he's in Australia first, because he runs a major media enterprise in Sydney, I think. I'm trying to remember whether it's Sydney or Melbourne. Anyway, and he's of Greek extraction. His father is how's this somewhat Greek, half Armenian. But when he first engaged with Hizmet, his father remembered all his Turkish, and people were blown away and his father was very comfortable in all three cultures. So this guy I ran into again when he and a group of people came to Washington for some conference about a year later. And so I met with them briefly. And it was in that context he said, well, you know, the thing about Hoca Efendi is he doesn't want you to do what he wants you to do. You said the right word. He empowers you. He wants you to empower yourself to do things. He wants you to find your path. He's not dictating the path. He wants you to find the path, which is kind of what you just said. It's not a charisma that enslaves, but that empowers.
Exactly. So, the first question connects to his journey from is related to his journey that you mentioned from a rather Turco-Islamic version, and his very unusual journey, which few can succeed, to a much more cosmopolitan and universal interpretation of it, especially after the time he touched the rest of the world himself personally. So and he had dreams about Turkey and about the rest of the world, and unfortunately, to some extent, it was responded with hostility from Turkey and from some corners of the rest of the world, with hostility in both contexts. So now that such trends still exist in Turkey and in other corners of the world with different reasons, different motivations, how do you recommend this audience to not to get discouraged, to continue doing what they are doing? This audience are already peer leaders and peer tutors of their peers and students of younger ages. So they are already leaders. And what is your highlight to them in that context?
Yeah, that's both an easy and a difficult question to answer. Because the easy answer is you have to have the courage of your own convictions and a sense of certainty that what you are trying to do is valid, and that it will ultimately, whatever that adverb means, ultimately bear positive fruit. And at the same time, of course, that's very easy to say. It's not always easy to do. And I don't want to just quote Hoca Efendi himself, but Hoca Efendi himself, of course, looks at the period that reached a particular kind of climax in July of 2016 and has moved forward, in a sense, from climax to climax since that time, as a kind of crucible, as a testing. And he has been consistent, and those who are closest to him have been consistent at reminding everyone who is part of Hizmet that you can't give up. It is a test, and you just have to keep pushing at it. The tricky part is you don't know when the test is going to end. If I look by analogy at the United States, because in the very same year, only it was in November of 2016, there were a great number of us who suddenly felt like we hit a wall when Donald Trump became the president. And over the next 4 years, that wall became thicker and higher and more radioactive than I ever could have imagined it would have been, with my sense of disappointment of November of 2016. Because every time I thought things couldn't be worse and he couldn't be worse, he outdid himself incredibly. It's the one thing I'll say about that man. He has not disappointed me. As bad as I thought it would be, he was worse and continued to get worse and worse and worse and worse. So we arrived 4 years later, and I didn't even realize until Friday after the election, when Pennsylvania was declared for Biden, what a sense of physical burden resting on my chest I had been experiencing for 4 years. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I was suddenly able to breathe again. And mind you, we're not out of the water. And there are many, 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 many challenges that are still present. But somehow, after that period of time, the people spoke in a loud enough voice. And I'm bitterly disappointed at the number of people who yet voted for Donald Trump, because clearly they're not hearing what I'm hearing. They're not seeing what I'm seeing. They're not feeling what I'm feeling. And I don't understand how that's possible. So this is an analogy, right? We went through a crucible, and hopefully we're past that, but who knows what will happen 4 years from now again. Alas, the condition and the situation in Turkey is not as abbreviated, because one of the things that Mr. Erdogan was able to do was to subvert the system so entirely that it's not as if there's a discrete number of years and then we have the chance of moving on to someone else. So it is much iffier where he is concerned. So then I think I'm a historian, so I think historically, and I think back to the man whom I think is most suitable as a model in certain ways for both Erdogan and Trump, and that's Adolf Hitler. And I think of it in very specific ways where Erdogan is concerned. As probably some of you are aware, his Nazi party set fire to a very important building, the Reichstag in Berlin, and blamed it on the communists who were the big competition for him politically. So he created an excuse to round up all the communists and send them to those camps called concentration camps. And of course, in July of 2016, it seems to me Erdogan affected the same thing. By ginning up a fake coup, he provided himself with what he had the temerity to refer to as Allah's gift, which was to be able to round up Hizmet and so on and so forth. There are many, many other parallels, and parallels also with my man Trump. But the point is, it was a much longer stretch of time. Hitler was in power for 12 years, but eventually he was gone. So I guess part of me is saying, at a certain point, someone like the person whom Erdogan always was or became, reaches a point of overstep that is so great that he ends up knocked over his own cliff. That doesn't mean that along the way, dozens, hundreds, thousands, even millions of people suffer or even perish. So it's not to be very sanguine about it. Oh, it's going to go, it'll be gone. It's not that easy. And I'm not unaware of the degree to which people have and are suffering in Turkey whom he suspects for one reason or another. They don't even have to be members of Hizmet, as you know. But I guess my feeling is we have to continue to do what we're doing. I'm in a different position. I'm a semi-outsider. I can't go to Turkey anymore, at least until he's gone. I'm a very, very small fish. I'm not a big fish in the pond, but he is paranoid enough that I know he even watches tiny fish with his system. But I can, and I freely do, speak and write about what I think he's about, and try and push back against the narrative, which of course is so entirely in his hands. My closest friend had an article for me to read last summer, or maybe it was even now 2 summers ago, in the New Yorker, which is a very, very highbrow, high-end, popular but intellectual kind of publication. Arts and literature and stuff like that, social sciences, not much, occasionally, not much on the hard sciences. And there was an article about Gülen. And it basically sounded like Erdogan had written it. I mean, this guy, Gülen, is dangerous, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'm thinking, this is a serious reporter who did not do his homework, because clearly he had written this article based on what he had been fed by the Erdoganian media, period, end of story. So my friend, because he knew that I was very close with Hizmet, wanted me to read it and respond because he was disturbed by it. Of course he was disturbed by it. And when I read it, I said to him what I just told you. I said, no, there are all kinds of inaccuracies in here that reflect very sloppy research on the part of a reporter who is very a highly reputed reporter. So my point is, I'm sorry I'm babbling on and on. My point is, I'm not pretending that this is easy. I am saying that people like me who, because we're, as it were, I'm not Turkish, I'm not Muslim, that positions me to say things which it would be more difficult for Ibrahim or any of you to say. But the things that you are doing, the things that he does, I can attest to, because I've watched him personally now for a couple of years in terms of the interfaith and multicultural and international and multi-ethnic kind of work that he does, the programs in which he's involved, that he either initiates or becomes part of. That speaks more eloquently. That is the walk. That is, to use the Greek term, the ergon, the action, and not just the words. And even if it's only a few people who realize, you know, what I've been reading can't be true, because look at the way these Hizmet people act. Clearly, what I've been reading is wrong. You can't get discouraged. You have to keep doing it, and you just keep doing it, and just keep doing it. I'll give you one sort of analog, right? I think my dream when I published my first book was, you know, I was going to be a bestseller. I'm going to become famous. People are going to ask for my autograph. I'm going to be better treated by my university because they're going to, you know, respect me. Well, it hasn't happened. I think I've written or edited 24 books now. And my attitude is, you know, I just keep writing my books. Maybe someday someone will say, wow, this guy's really something. But the point is, I'm also not doing it because, okay, so I'll become famous. I'm doing it because I'm doing it, because I'm interested in the stuff that I'm writing about. And you're doing what you're doing because it's important to you to be doing what you're doing. And that's what Haj Effendi would say. It's not because you want to be accepted, embraced, loved. It's because you need to accept, embrace, and love, because that's part of how you relate to each other and to God.
Thank you very much, Ori Hocam. So as you were speaking, I was recalling my time in Iraq when I was lecturing in Erbil. So I remember one of our students saying, well, our home was demolished 13 times by the Ba'ath regime during Saddam, and we built it 14 times. And you read about the country's history.
Yes.
And people were in that dust cloud back then, maybe many of them thinking that it will never end. But when you go to that same place now, you might need to ask that, did any of those happen? Looking at the prosperity, peace, and happiness there. So we are in this cloud right now, but you know what? Who knows what is beyond this? So there is this second question about hoşgörü. There is, given the emphasis on the concept of hoşgörü, what do you think needs to be done to help it better located and embraced in North America? So I understand this question as how we translate it, not in the dictionary sense, but how to make sure that this becomes an asset, which is a valuable asset. This becomes a valuable asset, a solidly American asset in the society we're living right now.
Yeah. I guess I sort of have a two-part answer. One is words, and the other is action. So the action is what I was already saying. And acting hoşgörü is demonstrating what hoşgörü is, in how I act towards you and how I speak with you, which is in an embracing manner, as opposed to use the word that used to be used all the time to translate it, tolerance. And then verbally, simply eschew the word tolerance, get away from the word tolerance, don't use the word tolerance, it's the wrong word. And embrace is a perfectly fine word, but there are other words that would work, that just or even phrases that express what it means, which is so much more than what the word tolerance means. And I think that's important. You know, in one of the classes that I teach, which is on the theological implications of the Holocaust, it's not about the Holocaust per se, it's about the theological implications. So the first part of the class, we are discussing, by way of reading about 8 or 9 different theologians, the question of the justice of God, theodicy. How is it that in a world made by God, deemed all powerful and all good and all merciful and engaged and involved and interested in human affairs, how is it that 1 million children are fried in ovens? How's that happen? And
quite a question.
I'm sorry?
Quite a question.
Quite a question, which, by the way, it won't surprise you to hear, by the time we have read through 8 or 9 theologians, each of which has proposed different ideas, none of them is an idea that really is foolproof, because there really is no way of answering that sort of question. But by about midway through the semester, we realized that maybe that's the wrong question. After all, God didn't build the gas chambers and the crematoria, humans did. So maybe we have to be asking the sociological and anthropological question, what are humans? And not where was God, where was man, in the generic non-gendered sense of that word. And in that context, we start to push in the direction of the possibility or the issue of dialogue, specifically for the purposes of that course in the Holocaust context between Jews and Christians. Obviously, it extends beyond Jews and Christians, but for the purposes of whom we're reading at that point, it's about dialogue. And the question that I end up posing to the students as a paper is genuine dialogue possible? And first, they've got to define what you mean by genuine dialogue as opposed to false dialogue. Because when you have religious dialogue, it can often be what I would call false dialogue. And that is, I actually know that mine is the truth, faith, yours is not. So we're having a conversation, but actually my motive, and it may even be hidden from me, is to convince you that mine is correct and yours is not. In order for there to be true dialogue, I have to be at a point where I recognize that as much as my faith is absolutely 100% perfect for me, that yours may be equally perfect for you. And by the way, I don't think that's a very difficult thing to recognize. All I have to do is look around me, especially in this season when the leaves are falling, and realize there are no 2 leaves that are alike. There are no 2 trees that are alike, and there are a zillion of them. Everybody knows that there are no 2 snowflakes that are alike. No 2 human faces, and we're relatively small in number relative to leaves and snowflakes. Just, I'm looking at this screen right now with 25 faces in front of me. No 2 of them are alike. We all have obvious physiological elements in common. No 2 of us are alike. So wouldn't it be absurd if the God who made all of this, with its infinite range of variety, were to be insistent that there's only one correct path to me? And that's, well, whatever the particular path is. And we come back to what I was saying earlier. If I think that may be my ego speaking and not God speaking. So there's no contradiction, but it may take time for some people to get comfortable with it, between my being absolutely certain that mine is the correct faith for me, and yet without any difficulty in embracing and not merely tolerating your form of faith as equally legitimate, but for you and not for me. Because when all is said and done anyway, what we know about God is what we know only through faith. So to presume that I know what God is arrogant and presumptuous on my part. To presume that I know through faith what God is for me, that's fine. But that I know what God is, and therefore I can tell you what God is, and what you know is wrong, that's astonishingly arrogant. And if we can overstep that, then of course, well, the world would be a better place. One of the things Hosh Effendi has said is, even atheists who are doing Hizmet work are doing God's work, they just don't know it, right? So I don't even have to believe in God and I can be doing the right thing, and I can believe in God in any of a zillion different ways and be doing the right thing, if what I'm doing is ultimately about helping others and not just pushing my own point of view. So the word, to harp on my word, the word tolerant, the tolerant doesn't say that. And that's why it's got to be removed from our vocabulary of translating, along with the actions which are already beyond just tolerance.
Does not. In 2 days, it is the World Day of Tolerance, and I've been hearing a lot of things circulating in social media. I'm still curious who is promoting this. You know,
yeah, I don't know.
In the 90s, it was very popular, but for many circles, it is openly, clearly outdated. But Monday is World Day of Tolerance, and there is quite excitement about it. I'm trying to really get a.
Well, you know, it's a step.
Yeah.
If you look at, and this is one of the people we read in my course, is Gregory Baum, who was very involved with the Vatican at the time when Pope John the 23rd organized the Second Vatican Conference, which was to open up dialogue between Catholics and non-Catholics, Christian non-Catholics, and of course non-Christians, and particularly Jews. In the aftermath of, it was the Eichmann trial that sort of brought the Holocaust back into focus for people. But if you read the verbiage, the initial verbiage of the Vatican Council, it was still about, okay, we recognize that the grace of God can be found in other faiths, but only fully realized in Catholicism. So they were still doing this, but it was a starting point. It was a starting point. And they needed to be further pushed, which Gregory Baum certainly was, to the point where it went from that to this, you know. So I have no objection to a day of tolerance. It's a good starting point.
Okay.
You know, if Donald Trump would tolerate, that would be a starting point. I don't expect him to embrace. I'll be happy if he tolerates as a starting point. If Erdogan tolerates, if Duterte tolerates, if all of these fascist dictators who seem to abound in different parts of the planet would just tolerate, I'd be satisfied with that as a starting point.
Yeah, let's recognize the merit of the word tolerance. Thanks for highlighting this. So, you know, now that you've been observing the movement for quite a while, and you mentioned your criticism in one of your earlier encounters, what are your most important highlights, including priorities that you see in Hizmet's journey in North America, including your criticism, and including your projection, where you see, which is a difficult thing, but where you see Hizmet is moving in the spectrum, social spectrum here.
Wow. Well, of course, one of the things about which Haj Effendi writes, and which one sees exemplified across 180 countries, is education. And you know, again, it's symptomatic of what Erdogan is and is not, that his first attack on Hizmet was to close down all those schools in a country, and that means every country, including the United States, that is desperately in need of schools. To close down schools is such a spectacularly cynical act. It's just, if it weren't said, I'd just be laughing all the way, you know? As you know, I have visited probably just not a huge number, half a dozen or so different Hizmet schools in Turkey when it was still possible to do that, here in different parts of the States, and in Australia. Those are the three countries in which I have visited. And again, the same features of those schools are reflected wherever. They're not teaching Islam. They're not teaching, you know, Turcophilism. They're teaching, period. But I also find interesting that one of my close friends from Hizmet, who is from Albania, who grew up as a very, very secular Muslim, his parents are still very secular, he became quite observant, not because anyone in the Hizmet school in Albania that he was going to was even slightly pushing him in that direction, but he was so taken with the kind of model that he saw in the people who were his teachers and his administrators that it drew him to a more observant Islam in and of itself. And that doesn't have to be the goal, and that doesn't have to happen. But the point is action and demonstration by what you are and not by what you're telling other people to be. But what struck me about the schools was not only, well, two things. One, the range of subject matter that reflected such a range of awareness of what it means to educate. Tbilisi, Georgia, also schools there. So 4 countries I've seen schools or visited schools. It's not just about math, and it's not just about science, and it's not just about language, it's not just about literature, it's also about music, it's also about visual art, it's also about sports. So everything about these schools is about considering the diverse parts of what we are as a species, and that require attention, and not just one part of what we are. And second, and this was particularly true or exemplified by a school, a high school that I visited in Melbourne, where the juniors and seniors had a project, which is that they were growing vegetables, organic vegetables, because there was space in that school to do that. And that made it possible to provide organic vegetables for the whole neighborhood that didn't have access to organic vegetables. It's not like the United States, or at least I should say parts of the United States, where you go to Whole Foods or something like that and you have the organic alternative. That just wasn't feasible. Suddenly they had organic food, right? So they were improving the gastronomic quality of the neighborhood. And the proceeds from selling this stuff was being sent to Africa, to a small community, I think it was in the Côte d'Ivoire, where it was being used, in fact, to build a school. So these kids were learning how the process of producing food comes about. You know, it isn't just, it appears on the supermarket shelves. A farmer has to work with nature and the forces of wind and sun and rain and snow, and has to deal with all kinds of things. So they're learning about that. They're learning about managing finances. And it's all applicable in the end to an act of Hizmet, to this school in Africa, which is not even a place they've been to personally. So education, schools, never doing other than expanding on that. And then the kind of programs that also connect people to people, I think are very important, and I hope and expect will continue with Hizmet. So I see those aspects of Hizmet continue to expand in spite of the fact that they've been snuffed out in Turkey itself. And who knows? One might say maybe that is God's hand in action. Maybe it is, so as to more forcefully redirect Hizmet away from those who might be Turcocentric, the way Hoca Efendi himself is not, who might be too Turcocentric. Well, you can't be, because what you're doing can't really be done in Turkey right now. So all the other places on the planet and all the other kinds of people who can and do appreciate the help that Hizmet offers, or the bridging that Hizmet offers, I see that as expanding. I do think that the last frontier is the gender frontier, and I do think that is expanding. So that even I would say, let's say in my visits to different places in the last 2 years, although in the last year there have been virtually none because of COVID, over against earlier times, more women more actively involved front and center and not just in the background. And I do think that's important. If for no other reason, then let's be real. Women make up more than 50% of what we are as a species. And so if we limit what we allow women to do, then we're limiting what more than 50% of the species can contribute to the improvement of the species. So if for no other reason, males have to be selfish and say we need to allow these people involved because it's a better for us, and not think of it as it's something that scares us. But just aside from that, it's just, if one is to be inclusive, one needs to be inclusive. If one is building bridges, one has to build bridges in all directions. And one bridge doesn't contradict another bridge. So that, and just in general, I hope and expect Hizmet to continue to expand, not shrink. And I do think that as incredibly difficult as I know it has been in Turkey, and in some cases beyond Turkey, because of the current regime there, that will eventually pass. And maybe Hizmet will be restored within Turkey itself. But meanwhile, there's so much to be done elsewhere. And there are voices. I was very happy, because I'm a basketball fan, to meet Enes Kanter a few years ago. And he, as you know, is very vocal. And because he is an NBA basketball player, his is a voice that gets to be heard, and heard by the kinds of people across America who might not hear you and me, but will hear him. And the emphasis that he places again and again when he speaks or writes publicly is on bridge building. It is on hoşgörü. It's not on criticizing Erdogan. It's on hoşgörü. And I think that's very valuable and very important. One of the things that Hoca has said a couple of times is, if Mr. Erdogan were ever to turn around and suddenly change, we would not attack him. We would not take advantage of our situation if we suddenly had the upper hand. But that's part of his inherent generosity of spirit. And maybe not all of us can think that, but that's not what we should be focusing on anyway. It's not on him. It's on what we can do for others in spite of him.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing all those together in your response to that question. So there are plenty of other questions that I would be happy to forward to you. But we are now at the end of our hour that was allocated to this exchange. And I appreciate your time and insights. And I hope our audience also has been happy with this, as we were exploring the history and the outreach and this very journey of Hizmet together.
My pleasure. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederiz hocam. So thank you everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of it.